Thanks, Stu, for the recording. Okay, so we do have over 40, and I'm sure some more will trickle in, but it's such a very packed agenda that I think it'd be really good for us to get started. So a warm welcome to everyone. This webinar on protecting children from harm in the climate crisis, strategies for action through adaptive programming, policy, and advocacy. And we truly are going to cover all of those things today, or try to as best we can, in addition to understanding just a little bit more about the context and the intersectionality between child protection predominantly and climate change. Just before we get, just a little housekeeping notes. I'm not sure where everyone is tuning in from today, but if there is a need for captions, translation captions, I could read through this slide, but just for you to have a look, there's a way to click on more and language and speech, and then you can turn on the live captions. And then with the 3 dots there, you can change that to a language that you prefer. So for this particular presentation, there's no live interpretation available. However, there's a couple of different solutions around this. So if we have Spanish or French speakers on this, if you could kind of have a look at the diagram there, there's a way to click on those 3 dots to get the translation. I'll leave it up for just a moment. Okay. Okay. Let's get started. So this is the agenda. It doesn't look like a lot on one slide, but believe me, the slides are very full. We have a lot of interesting, hopefully we're going to have a lot of interesting discussions today. So as I mentioned, we'll start out with the context, what we know about climate change and in terms of how it's exacerbating child protection risk and climate change as a child rights issue, in particular looking at some of the legal and policy frameworks. With adaptive programming, I will be talking a bit about the child protection focus areas. Then I'm also joined by Jonathan, who will take us through a bit on education and the integration of protection and education as well. We'll talk a bit about adaptive advocacy, go through some of the climate protection advocacy messages that we have been developed, and we'll also have a very interesting example or case study, if you will, from Thailand. Hopefully, we'll have time for question and answers. We did book this to go an hour and 15 minutes, and hopefully you can stay that long if we have a lot of questions and we have a lot of discussion. Okay, before I pass off, just to introduce all the different people that we do have speaking today. So I'm David, I'm the moderator, and I'll also be talking a bit about the adaptive programming. I'm the Asia Regional Senior Child Protection Humanitarian Advisor. We have Steve Miller with us, who's the Global Child Protection Director for SCI. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. Bess Herbert, who is an advocacy specialist and I think wears many different hats for ending corporal punishment and is quite an aficionado in this area of linking climate change and protection. Laura Abado, who's the thematic advisor for child rights, climate, environment with SC Sweden and SCI. Jonathan Valdez, who I mentioned earlier, who's the senior advisor for climate change, education, and child protection for SCUS. Allison Wright, I haven't seen you here yet, Allison, but I hope you're here, who's our global head of policy and advocacy for child protection. And then from Thailand, we have I'm not going to butcher her name, climate change and green skills technical advisor from Thailand. Thank you all for joining us. And I'll pass over to you, Steve, for the for opening remarks.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, David. And great to see so many people coming on stream. I'm going to be really brief, but welcome thank you for joining us and for your commitment to addressing the critical intersection between climate change and child protection. I think it goes without saying, it really does, that Save the Children stands at the forefront of child protection globally. We have always risen to meet challenges. We've adapted our strategies to protect children under ever-changing circumstances. And today, that is needed more than ever. We must address the strong link between climate change and violence against children. We are prepared for this, and the urgency has never been greater. As you'll hear later today, climate change is a powerful structural driver of violence against children, and its impacts fall most heavily on children in vulnerable situations who are least responsible and will bear the brunt of the consequences. Communities are grappling with the fallout of climate extremes. Areas like the Horn of Africa, where up to 30% increase in female genital mutilation. We are seeing levels of child labor rise for the first time in 20 years. This, in addition to the devastating impacts on children's mental and physical health and the knock-on effects of stressed parents, caregivers competing for increasingly scarce resources. We also cannot ignore the exponential rise in migration and displacement. Climate change has forced so many people to flee their homes, a last resort that tears children from the safety they know and puts them at great risk. As we know, unaccompanied and separated children are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, including trafficking, sexual abuse, or recruitment by armed actors. Save the Children is committed to scaling up our efforts in climate work, focusing on strengthening child protection systems that are capable of addressing issues of child labor, child marriage, and the effects of large-scale migration and displacement. Today, all of us here we have a shared commitment to protecting children from violence exacerbated by climate change. Together, we hope to develop strategies that will not only respond to these challenges, but also anticipate and mitigate future risks. So thank you once again for your dedication. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And thank you to David and others who've really made this all happen. Appreciate that. And back to you, David.
Thanks, Steve. Well said. We'll get right to it. Bess is the slide. Bess has joined us, as I mentioned, having a background in different areas within child protection, but most significantly with the EVAC movement and ending violence against children. Bess, I don't know if you want to take over control of the slides or if you want me to move them along. Just say so and I'll do so. Thank you. Over to you, Bess.
Thank you, David and Steve. I don't know, let's see what happens with the slides. But it's really great to be with you today to talk about this incredibly important topic and very concerning topic. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about some of the work that I did looking into the connections between the climate crisis and violence against children. And this draws on lots of other people's work, not least Save the Children. And what I'll talk about today is really just a snapshot. I wrote a few articles about the topic, and one of them I've shared in the chat. That includes a lot more detail and some of the references. And can I just check that you can hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay, I will carry on. Okay, so first slide. So if we just a little bit of context on the climate crisis. So, you know, so much to say, but basically the huge and growing impacts of the climate crisis are recognised that they will increasingly affect all dimensions of society. And children's, it's recognised as the defining human and child rights challenge of our generation, the greatest threat to health and well-being in current times, particularly for children. And it's recognised that 1 billion children, including many of the most disadvantaged and those living on the climate front line, are today already at extreme risk. from the impacts of climate change. And why are children so affected? Because of their physical and physiological vulnerability and their dependence on others, which means that they are affected first and most. And in addition, because they will experience the compounding and worsening effects of the climate crisis for the rest of their lives. So I think it can easily be argued that children have the greatest stake in the climate crisis and in climate action. There's really no other group that has such a big stake as them, and yet they continue not to be fully represented in action to address climate and concrete measures to address the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So it's clear that the climate crisis is affecting children's rights to health, survival and education, but is it increasing their risk of violence? And sometimes people feel like we're trying to bring together two unrelated topics here. But I will go through some of the context where we can clearly see the connection. It's important to say that there's a real lack of rigorous research in this area. There are some systematic reviews, for example, in relation to climate effects and child marriage, but most of what we have is in reports, which together paints a very worrying picture. So there is a need for more research and information. However, if we go through some of the context, so first of all, disaster and humanitarian settings. Let me just check. So yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to go between a few different screens here. So it's obviously well recognised that the climate crisis will lead to an increase in disasters and humanitarian crises. And sadly, there is already plenty of evidence of children's increased risk of violence in these settings. Impoverished and struggling families lose the little security that they had, and in climate and humanitarian hotspots, people may face overlapping and repeated crises, making recovery impossible. And in this context, families are forced to make desperate decisions with long-term negative impacts on children, such as withdrawing them from school so they can work, arranging an early marriage, etc. We also see the breakdown in government and community function and oversight combined with desperate living conditions, which makes it much easier to exploit children, with separated, orphaned, disabled and traumatised children particularly vulnerable. Sexual, domestic and family violence is especially high when families have lost everything and are forced to live in emergency accommodation. Adolescent girls often report high levels of sexual harassment and abuse in the aftermath of disasters, which may be enabled by overcrowding in shelters, lack of privacy, lighting, separate facilities for women and girls, etc. Next slide, please. Thank you, David. So it's not just fast onset disasters, but slow onset disasters such as drought and water shortages that can powerfully increase children's risk of violence. Drought makes the task of water collecting, often done by women and children, much more hazardous. They're forced to walk further to more isolated areas. Women and girls report being targeted for sexual assault, forced to have sex in exchange for access to water, and being beaten by family members for taking too long to collect water. For families dependent on the land, the loss of income caused by drought means that they can't afford a nutritious diet, can't afford to keep children in school or pay for healthcare. And again, to survive, families increasingly adopt negative coping strategies such as child marriage, leaving children unaccompanied while adults try to find work or resources, child labour that increases children's exposure to harm and violence, and child involvement in transactional sex in exchange for money or food. Next slide, please. So food scarcity is another context which is being hugely exacerbated by climate change, which is threatening the global food supply, whereby crop yield is declining within a context of increased demand. And food crises cause population displacement, increase community and family stress, and again can lead families to adopt negative coping strategies. And in addition to this, researchers have found that prenatal and early childhood malnourishment is associated with aggression and violence. And researchers have argued that considering the potential scale of food insecurity, its effects on the levels of aggression in society shouldn't be underestimated. Next slide, please. So displacement and migration is another well-recognised consequence of many climate impacts, and children are particularly vulnerable during population displacements, even more so if they're orphaned, separated from their families. They often have limited or no access to essential services, including education, protection and healthcare, and are exposed and vulnerable to violence, exploitation and trafficking. Parents report severe stress and fear during displacement. Living conditions are very difficult. They have little access to necessary resources and often can't provide for children's needs, and struggle to care for children while dealing with their own trauma. And in this context, rates of domestic violence, violent punishment, and physical and emotional abuse within families can increase. Next slide, please. Conflict. I'm sorry, I don't have an example for this. I will find one sometime. So climate change is recognised as a threat multiplier for conflict, particularly in areas of resource scarcity, in fragile states, and where households are most dependent on natural resources. And of course, climate impacts, competition over natural resources and fossil fuels are factors in several of the current major global conflicts. So as well as the obvious inherent dangers and harm of conflict for children, violence can become normalised, and the education, health, protection and other services upon which children may depend may also break down or become inaccessible despite heightened need. Sexual assault is common, especially for girls, while boys are more likely to face injury or death, abduction and recruitment to armed groups, and children with disabilities may suffer high levels of neglect and abandonment. Increased rates of sexual exploitation, slavery, and forced marriage and labour are also seen. Next slide, please. So as well as those contexts where there is really a very large body of evidence that there is an increased risk of violence to children, there are actually lots of other contexts where there's been very little focus or attention, but very concerning indications that violence against children is increasing. So, for example, evidence that gender-based violence increases after forest fires, higher rates of sexual violence in areas surrounding mining and extractive industries, child abuse admissions to accident and emergency departments increase during heat waves, and multiple reports that child land defenders, climate activists, and Indigenous children are targeted in violent ways when they seek to protect their land. Next slide, please. So taking all of this together into account, we can say that the climate crisis increases children's risk of multiple forms of violence through multiple compounding pathways, and that the climate crisis is a structural driver of violence against children. And there's maybe three ways that I would understand this happening. So the climate impacts put severe strain on households, particularly the most vulnerable. Stresses include loss of livelihood, homes and resources, rising food prices and water scarcity, social upheaval and forced migration, being forced to live in very difficult conditions, for example, extreme heat. Households are pushed beyond their capacity to cope, increasing family violence and forcing families to make desperate decisions to survive that have devastating impacts on children's safety, such as arranging early marriages. Secondly, the climate crisis also exposes more children to high-risk contexts such as conflict, displacement and natural disasters. And thirdly, it erodes the family, community and government protective capacities and response services. And then there's just an example at the bottom from Kenya about how the kind of escalating impacts were felt by children in the community that was experiencing drought. Next slide, please. So these impacts are even more concerning when you consider the huge and growing number of children affected by climate impacts. And there's just a few listed on this slide, but there are many more. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of children being affected by all of these various climate impacts. For example, 1 billion people will be vulnerable to coastal flooding by 2050. And I think the point to make here is that we need to be making the case for very big scale interventions to protect children within all of these contexts, and that child protection needs to be mainstreamed into all climate action. Next slide, please. So, yeah, in conclusion, the climate crisis is increasing children's risk of multiple forms of violence in multiple ways and contexts with potentially very large-scale impact. And I would argue there are 3 priority actions. First of all, to make visible the connection between violence against children and the climate crisis, and to seek to have it addressed together in policy, programming and funding. Secondly, that we need to see wide-scale implementation of preventative and protective strategies, and I'm really glad that the coming speakers will talk about that. And then, of course, we need enhanced, adequate climate action so that we avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. That's all from me. That was a whirlwind tour. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing about the solutions from other people.
Incredibly rich, Bess. Thank you so much. Sorry, I forgot to mention at the beginning that I'm sure there's going to be loads of questions as we go through, but because of the schedule with the timing, if you could make a note of those or put them down in the chat box, and I think we'll try to monitor those as we go along. I'm assuming that the hand raised is a question. If it's some other issue, maybe you could type that in the chat as well. Laura, I'm handing over to you.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. Hi, colleagues. So I'm Laura Bado, and I work for both Save the Children Sweden and Save the Children International, both for the child rights, equality and social justice team and the Goal 4 SNRF, Safety Nets and Resilient Families team on specifically child rights governance as it links to climate programming, including climate advocacy. Bess has provided a contextual description of how the climate and environmental crisis affects children and intensifies the need to take action to prevent and address children's well-being, safety and protection needs. And also, Bess, you mentioned the role, how it affects parents, and so the impact of that on children and how also it affects the government capacity to respond, which is something that we often forget, that the capacity is also challenged in with regards to climate. So I think my intervention comes actually to just complement a bit that, to give a context that is more about the policy and legal framing for this discussion. So looking at what states are supposed to do in relation to this, but really keep in mind, we know the context, and it's a challenging context that we're dealing with. So I will take over the control of this slide to see if I can move it here to see. Yeah. Do you see it moving as well? Yeah. So as we have heard, the climate and environmental crisis has a disproportionate impact on children. So when we say impact on children at Save the Children, we most often mean impact on the realization of their rights, the right of girls, boys, and non-binary children. And for us, climate and environmental crisis is a child rights crisis, right? It affects the realization of most, if not all, children's rights, and we think their rights should be realized. And also, I have marked in green, you see here a bit, some of these rights that maybe are more connected to the discussion today, but all our rights are interlinked. And if we want to give an example, like from the substantive rights, the right to protection from violence and exploitation, or to be protected as a refugee, would fall under those rights that are affected. And if we want to think about procedural rights that are relevant here, for example, I would think about the right to information when it comes to especially right to information in context of extreme weather events, for example, or access to justice and to remedies. That also could be really relevant for discussions when it comes to protection. So when we say rights, we also mean implementation of these rights, and they're in relation to the rights holders that should be protected and listened to, and the duty bearers, right, that have committed to protect children and to listen to them. And to conclude on this one, just to really highlight, I know for many of us it's obvious, but it does mean something to talk not just about rights, but also about corresponding state obligations and state accountability. And sometimes also it means the accountability of the private sector, but we're not going to go into that today. So what do we mean with that state accountability when it comes to children's rights and protecting children in the context of climate change and unhealthy environment? This is a mistake. You should not be seeing this one in the end. I will put it all together here. So basically, if you, just to guide you through this really, really full slide, I wanted to highlight, so which are the state's commitments? Children's rights are protected under various frameworks, both human rights frameworks, which you see on the left, beside the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that all of us know. There's also regional treaties, but also resolutions that really guide how, give recommendations and guide what states are supposed to do in relation to this. I would mention, for example, Resolution 4530 of the Human Rights Council of 2020, which is on child rights through a healthy environment, which also touches upon protection, violence against children, various protection aspects, which is really relevant for this work. I would also mention, for example, the Commission on the Status of Women's meeting, where they had a great conclusion in 2022 in relation to climate. Then on the right side, you will think about the environmental related treaties and policies. And here we often talk about the Paris Agreement, for example, or the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. That also, these are also commitments that states have. And in the middle, we will mention the SDGs, more the Sustainable Development Frameworks. So why I'm mentioning these things is just that one and the same state, if it is party to all of these treaties and is member of the UN or a regional intergovernmental body, it has to relate to all of them at the same time. And we too. So it means that you cannot implement the Paris Agreement on climate change without implementing at the same time the Convention on the Rights of the Child, considering children's rights. And you cannot, similarly, you cannot have a child rights policy at country level that doesn't consider climate impacts on children. So these are really realities where, which I wanted to put on the table as well for us today. And then what is in blue there, it's in 2023. So last year, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child adopted General Comment 26 on children's rights and environment with special focus on climate change. And that is really the framework that really helps us make the bridge between these frameworks on the slide and explains what states are supposed to do in relation to children's rights and the environment. So that is something that I will talk a bit more about. This general comment was adopted in May and launched in September 23. I'm sure many of you have been involved in the consultations in relation to that. Save the Children has supported also children's participation in these consultations. It's adopted by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is the treaty, the body of experts that monitor the implementation of the convention. So it's the first time that the right to a healthy environment of children has been recognized. And it describes how environmental degradation and climate change affects the fulfillment of children's rights. And I will also highlight just in a minute what elements relating to child protection that we find in it. And it reinterprets the convention, really looking at the context of climate, but also all other environmental hazards, environmental degradation aspects like toxics and things like that. So from January 24, it became part of the dialogue questions that each time a state will be reporting on how it's implementing the convention, they will have to also cover what are they doing in relation to climate and environment. So this is something that states will have to report on. The committee will be asking about, which means that also us as civil society organizations and when we work with children and partners, we can bring this up, and it means we can bring child protection aspects as well, monitor these issues, not just for our sake, but also bring it up when our states are discussing with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. So this is the content of General Comment 26, and I just highlighted some aspects that were particularly relevant for today. I think the 4 principles of the UN Convention are always relevant, in particular the best interest of the child, which often has implications in relation to child protection. And then there's a whole section on right to freedom from violence. And you also have the obligations of states, so the general measures of implementation and the adaptation section that has content that's relevant for today. I just extracted, it's not exhaustive, but I just extracted these sections for your attention. So section G, so 35, paragraph 35 and 36. If you see on 35, it talks about, like Beth was saying, the climate crisis, a form of structural violence against children, and really talking about the risk that's being aggravated, the fragile child protection systems, talk about child marriage. So all these things that actually Beth mentioned are mentioned in the general comment as well. I think it was interesting to also touch upon this physical and psychological violence that also I think Steve mentioned. And just to mention additional references in this general comment, it talks about armed conflicts, younger children and toxics and how they are impacted differently, obligations of state to regulate businesses in relation to the impact they may have on their activities may have on children. Business sector, environmental abuse, so themselves, what governs businesses. Adaptation, under the adaptation section, there is also recommendations how to strengthen the child protection system, addressing underlying causes of vulnerability, climate-induced displacement, etc. So just wanted to highlight this for you so that you get interested in this general comment, because as I said, like this will be really our Bible a little bit now in relation to climate and environment work. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Just going to see if I can take control here. Yeah. Great, thanks. Again, I'm sure there's probably loads of questions regarding the policy and legal frameworks aspect of this. So please make notes and put them in the chat, and we'll collect them as we go through. Okay, over to myself now. I'm going to start talking about some of the adaptive programming with which a lot of this started with the task team. We have a child protection and climate change task team. It's been around for about 2 years now. We started out with climate change specialists, with child protection specialists, including specialists in certain sub-themes of child protection, both for humanitarian development side, with advocacy specialists, and with specialists in cross-cutting themes such as mental health and psychosocial support, MHPSS, migration and displacement. We started the task team at a time when protection was largely absent from the climate change agenda as compared to other goal areas, and we wanted to ensure that based on the mounting evidence, data, a lot of the things we've been hearing today, indicating that protection risks are being greatly exacerbated by climate change, and that protection would be an important part of the overall agenda, a sort of centrality of protection mindset we wanted to bring to this. We also wanted to start off with the idea of not necessarily needing to develop an entirely new program or framework. We have evidence-based common approaches, for example, but what we really wanted to do was to ensure that we were embedding climate or integrating climate across all of our work, from the assessments that we do to the analysis of that to the preparedness level, yes, but also in our response and our prevention and in our mitigation work, both humanitarian and development context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these 5 areas, what we've done, what we're planning to do, and a bit later in the webinar on gathering feedback on what we should be doing and how we can support country offices to advance in their climate and child protection work. So the big piece I think that we've done well with is this with child protection system strengthening, and in particular from response. So I think we've already heard quite a bit today, the link between climate and child protection risk needs to be better embedded in our child protection systems work, system strengthening work, as well as within climate change adaptation and mitigation programs and approaches. So while child protection systems includes both response and prevention initiatives and capacity building, under this particular part of the programmatic offer, we focus on strengthening the work of caseworkers, of social service workforce, and kind of the overall systems, so as to ensure that case management work is climate informed, responsive, and resilient. And that it really informs all of our work, including, I think we heard quite a bit already from Bess and others, the significant gendered impacts of climate change, as well as to strengthen the capacity and quality of the social welfare workforce through capacity development, technical support, including in our work with community-led protection mechanisms. So, you know, overarchingly, we wanted to ensure an understanding amongst social service workforce of climate throughout all the stages of the case management process, particularly at the assessment and the planning stages and targeting, you might say, but also in implementation and in reviewing and ideally closing cases, the ambition of all of our work. This work is relevant in both development and humanitarian context, and with a better understanding of how climate is impacting communities and exacerbating risk, we can respond more effectively in a climate resilient manner. So the guidance that we have, we also hope that it informs in special circumstances where children may be on the move or in cross-border contexts, which we're seeing more and more frequently, and even in times of conflict, again, what was brought up a bit earlier. We have examples of cross-border work from Venezuela and Colombia, where Save the Children worked with communities facing numerous climate risks to develop action plans aimed at strengthening community and more formal child protection systems to more effectively address the cross-border case management work that they were doing. In context of conflict, we understand that climate change can be and is one of many drivers. This helps us to prepare and respond to grave and other serious child rights violations. It can also help us to mitigate and prevent grave violations against children. Moving on, I wanted to also just mention, since we're in a strategy refresh period, we want to reiterate that in this new strategy period, climate is more prominent, not only in the Live Free from Violence goal, but across all of the goals. Our child protection work in response under outcome 2 specifically includes climate resilient services. In measuring and evaluating the case management work, we use what's called the quality of services tool. And this has now been updated to include climate resilient case management services and questions that go with that. So you can see the outcome there for itself. Move on to from the prevention and mitigation side. This is where we're having loads of discussion around what specifically should we be focused on. But it's again to link it with the strategy refresh period. Sorry, a bit of. Wow. Have you been hearing me?
Yes, you were just muted for about 10 seconds.
Last 10 seconds exactly. Last 10 seconds.
Okay. I'm very sorry. I'll start from the beginning with this. I was just beginning to get into talking about the work that we're doing in terms of the prevention and mitigation side of child protection. This is driven by the first outcome, which doesn't, like outcome 2, specifically mention climate resilience in a way that outcome 2 does. However, there are really strong links with safe environments, the language that's in the first outcome, implying that climate safe and that much of the work in prevention and mitigation seeks to address harmful social and gender norms. And as we heard from the outset from Steve and from Bess, climate change is exacerbating harmful social and gender norms. So much of our work in this area is still in development. We're trying to develop some tools and guidance on the best way to ensure that our, for example, flagship common approach in this area, Safe Families, can be better climate informed and responsive, as well as common approaches in development, such as seeds or community-led child protection. Much of this work happens intuitively with communities, as communities really bear the brunt of climate impacts. What we need to ensure is that protection is integrated into all of our work with communities and children as linked to climate responsive and resilient programs and approaches. Other initiatives which are nexus in nature or crossing over the humanitarian development bridge include ensuring that all of our assessment work in humanitarian development context is climate informed. This includes protective and risk factors analysis to prioritize drivers of specific protection risks and helping to develop appropriate and feasible prevention activities. And I'd like to note here that the Child Protection Global Alliance Primary Prevention Framework as a tool that is not specifically designed with climate change in mind, but it can help determine how children, communities, and other stakeholder groups prioritize climate as a cause and a driver of protection risk. We have a few other initiatives focused on conflict, grave violations, as well as climate responsive mainstreaming and integration, which I'll cover in the next slide, I believe. Yeah, what we call the humanitarian considerations. Big focus on preparedness and anticipatory actions, which for those of you in the humanitarian world, this is a huge buzzword at the moment. But in humanitarian settings, really all of our work, it starts with preparedness. It cuts across preparedness, anticipatory actions. It focuses on both response and prevention to protection, risk, and vulnerabilities exacerbated by climate change, such as sexual and gender-based violence, forms of exploitation, early marriage, child labor, and exclusion on the basis of disability and gender. Our programs link with the existing disaster risk reduction initiatives to the greatest extent possible. And we also continue to explore mainstreaming, joint programming, and integration opportunities with all sectors, in particular as linked with centrality protection. At the global level and as related to conflict, SCI has been a key informant with the UN Special Representative's Office on Children and Armed Conflict on the development of a discussion paper on the intersectionality between climate insecurity and 6 grave violations against children, more broadly, and armed conflict overall. You can find that discussion paper on our Live Free from Violence one-stop shop. We've recently launched the Child Protection Anticipatory Briefing Note and Matrix of Interventions. It includes anticipatory actions across multiple risk areas such as dangers and injuries, physical and emotional maltreatment, sexual and gender-based violence, children associated with armed forces and armed groups, and child labor, and really importantly, across multiple hazard types. Slow and rapid onset, of course, the things that we traditionally work on in our preparedness work, but also conflict, displacement contexts, economic crisis, and even epidemics. We're working to ensure that all of our preparedness initiatives and child protection take into account the link between climate and protection risk. In conflict contexts, we're working to ensure that our contextual and situational analysis work on grave and other serious child rights violations is climate informed and responsive. In particular, we're updating our field-friendly guidelines on monitoring, reporting on grave and other serious child rights violations. May be behind time, I hope not. With regards to migration and displacement, so these are the cross-cutting areas that we've been working on with the task team. Climate change is increasingly a really important driver of migration. I think we've heard a lot of that today. And when children migrate or are displaced due to climate-induced shocks, they're more vulnerable to separation, violence, abuse, and exploitation. The development of child-appropriate protection frameworks and for climate-induced displacement to produce recommendations on basic principles for children moving internally or across borders because of the effects of climate change and inclusion of displaced children's priorities in national adaptation plans. And this is something that Alison might talk a little bit about with advocacy, the advocacy and policy link. From a practical perspective, really understanding and identifying where the hotspot areas, those areas that are impacted by climate-induced shocks on a regular basis, and work with preparedness teams to ensure safer migration, as well as localized climate change adaptation programming. we've been talking with the Migration and Displacement Initiative team on any amendments that might be needed with regards to the Durable Solutions Toolkit for children that are displaced by climate change, including physical safety, psychosocial safety components. And again, I think the MDI team is delivering quite a bit on research projects to explore, child migration pathways from rural to urban areas associated with climate risk and subsequent implications on children's social and economic development in urban settings. MHPSS, there's evidence, we've heard quite a bit, with regards to evidence that children and youth are at increased risk of poor mental health outcomes as related to their understanding and awareness of climate change, including feelings of anxiety and grief. And in addition, the high prevalence of pre-existing mental conditions is really poorly recognized in most settings, but it can have a significant impact on resiliency and adaptation capacity of those households, those communities, and parents' ability to provide protective and nurturing care. So, MHPSS components are also essential to a comprehensive protection response to climate change, including strengthening resilience, support for distress, and initial provision of basic psychological support, which we do a lot of already, individual and collective engagement in climate change adaptation resilience, and capacity to adopt mitigation efforts. All of these things can be enhanced through MHPSS activities. We have a few key initiatives that are in the works this year. One is very similar to some of the other things that we've done, in that we're already using this. We have a child and youth resiliency program, a package, making sure we're embedding climate into that and maybe even developing specific modules, given the impact that climate is having on the well-being of children and communities. Climate guidance there's a practical guide for understanding and responding to loss and grief among children affected by migration and displacement, making sure that is also climate friendly. And another big development in the humanitarian context, where we refer to a lot of psychosocial support activities as group activities for child well-being. There's a toolkit and a manual is currently in development, and we're working with that team to ensure that it's climate aware, informed, responsive, and resilient. I want to quickly finish with an example of integration. Integration works both ways. And in this example, we focus on how our work in sexual and gender-based violence can be integrated into existing climate change adaptation programs. It's not always just climate into the existing work that we do. And we're seeing this because we're seeing climate change adaptation programs more and more frequently. So we've included climate change as part of the foundational actions in the new sexual and gender-based violence multi-sectoral framework, which should be available for launch any day now, particularly in crisis settings. And with the climate change adaptation teams assessing, determining where hotspot areas of climate-induced disasters, crises, and areas where SGBV may be exacerbated in preparedness for prevention, response, and mitigation, SGBV interventions. And then, I already mentioned this idea that we've added climate change as a sector, and it doesn't just focus on one particular area of response. It focuses on everything from assessment to preparedness to the response to prevention and mitigation. Okay. I hope I didn't run over on that. And I'm going to pass over to Jonathan now for some really interesting examples from education and also the nexus between the two. Over to you, Jonathan.
Yes, thank you, David, and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to everyone who's joining the webinar tonight. So in terms of integration, I think one very interesting and very prominent example of integration is the education and child protection integration. So with this, I would focus my presentation and sharing around the climate resilience in education, a program offer. So as most of you may know, there's a program offer that was launched last year. And there are two documents that were two sets of documents that were developed in this from this program offer. There's an external document which is meant to position as Save the Children as a leader in the climate action and education space. So this external document shows our theory of change, the results that we tend to achieve, our capacity building for resilience in education sector, and a strong focus on evidence building. One thing that's applicable to us is the internal document, which mostly shows, aside from what was shared for the external document, is that it outlines the strategic priorities or what we need to do, our evidence building initiatives and learning agenda, our programming and results framework, and it also provides a snapshot of the inventory of our programming resources, monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning and advocacy. And later on this year, the Climate Resiliency and Education Program offer menu of activities and strategies will also be finalized and launched. Next slide, please. So from this program offer, I'd like to focus on the theory of change. So as you can see on your screen, the theory of change is directly linked to the safe back to school and learning goal. It states that if the education sector is resilient to climate change and contributes to climate justice, we will enable all children in all contexts to be safe back to school and learning. So this theory of change is structured in four interconnected outcomes, and these interconnected outcomes inherently support one another, and if implemented together, actions will be more effective, efficient to achieve the goal. So it is based on a socio-ecological model, and it applies to children of all ages. So this theory of change also covers young children, specifically on early learning and well-being. And it also covers learning in all spaces and in development and humanitarian settings. Inherent to this theory of change is the fact that a resilient education sector requires an intersectoral approach, recognizing that schools are a platform to provide health and protection services for children and their families, which become even more critical during climate-induced disasters and during slow onset climate changes. So within this theory of change and in the four outcomes, I would emphasize on how education and child protection are integrated in this outcome. So, for example, within the climate resilient learners outcome, so this pertains to individual skills, knowledge, attitudes that need to be improved to make children caregivers, teachers, and education sector staff resilient to climate change. This includes curriculum, extracurricular activities, trainings, particularly in assessing the risks, including child protection risks, preparing for and anticipating and responding to, including overall risk management. This also includes providing well-being support and social and emotional learning both in school, learning sites, and at home. The second outcome, which is around climate resilient learning environments, this emphasizes the safety, health, and protection setting in within the school infrastructure and services. So we can say that the school and the learning site facilities that are functional and accessible to children, including in the event of disasters, emergencies, and crises, can help prevent, mitigate violence and abuse that children may experience or are exposed to, and even augment the services that they need that are not accessible in the communities during disruptions in services. In terms of sustained access and quality and continuity, the multi-secular approach of this outcome allows education authorities, school leaders, and management to integrate child protection services in climate-informed school safety and risk management plans, including prevention, response, and referral mechanisms. So this outcome, to achieve it, requires the child protection system to be in place, climate informed, and responsive to the needs, especially of children. The last outcome is focused on finance to support adaptations, resilience, and policy implementation, which is critical to sustainable and scalable change. This entails the policy providing technical guidance and ensuring that education sector is financed through climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. So having an inclusive, intersectoral, and all hazard framework approach for the education sector needs it needs a child protection system and relevant services in place to ensure that preparedness, anticipatory action, response, and adaptation plans are supported to maintain protection and education continuity. Next slide, please. So, in order to operationalize or build the capacity of staff, there are two current initiatives that are being implemented now. One of it is the CRESTA, or the Climate Responsive ECCD Systems Thinking Approach. So this approach also comes with a ongoing webinar where we are covering 4 cohort countries, and as you can see on the objectives, it focuses on developing adaptive skills and support all children, caregivers, and teachers to cope with the increased adversity in their environment. Another objective is that uh, it aims to protect and nurture young children relationships with their caregivers. And the last one is increase the accessibility, quality, and scale of inclusive and holistic education services, including child protection services and nurturing care programs. The next one is if you can move to the next slide, please. So another capacity building that is ongoing is around the Climate Resilient Programming in Education, or CRPE. So this capacity building initiative introduces the climate solutions design process. So this climate solutions design process uh, refers to a layered analytical framework that practitioners can use to integrate climate resilience into their programming, and makes up the core of the climate resilient programming in education toolkit. So in the next slide, I'll show you that within this CSDP process, if you can move to the next slide, please. So as an example of program design integration, within the climate solutions design process, as an example, you can see that within the identification stage or in the assessment stage of a project, we can look at climate hazards and vulnerability assessments that incorporates child protection risks with focus on the most impacted by inequities and highly vulnerable. So in this context, we should also focus on the differential impacts of climate change, particularly to young children who are more vulnerable than other children in several contexts and settings. Part of also of the identification and assessment phase of this climate solutions design process is that resources on child protection systems and services existing are being assessed. And within these resources, we will be able to identify what are the gaps and or what are the climate solutions that we can incorporate, which we can include in our design phase. So within the design phase of the climate solutions design process, the climate solutions and intended results integrate child protection through systems approach, and also through direct interventions focusing on young children and adolescents. So another example that I'd like to highlight in the next slide is an example of a program where we can see climate change intersections with child protection as a component of the program. So this example of a project is on the USAID Lego Foundation Childhood Development Activity in Ethiopia. So the context of this project is that there's a combination of conflict, climate-related crisis, and national disasters that resulted in staggering 7.6 million children out of school, with an estimated 8% of which are preschool age. So with this example project or interventions, so the program action provides essential early childhood education and services through the following activities. So one is the improving the safety of the learning environment, including establishment of temporary learning spaces or learning sites, implementation of play-based pre-primary education, including provision of inclusive and context-appropriate teaching and learning materials, or TLM, and educators or teachers training and capacity building. So this also incorporates nutritional assistance such as hot meals, high energy biscuits, and other uh, provision of nutritious food. And also, this incorporates caregivers and parents training to support children's learning at home, including looking at social and emotional and learning and well-being. Lastly, which is also a child protection component of the program, is including mental health and psychosocial support initiatives that targets teachers, training teachers to provide these services to children within the learning sites or ECCD center setting. So these are some of the examples of program integration on child protection and education. And over to you, David.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great. Well, I'm a bit concerned because there's so many good questions in the chat box, and I have no idea how we're going to get to them all. But let's keep moving. Alison, it's over to you to talk a little bit about from the advocacy perspective.
Thanks so much, David. And I feel your pain in trying to keep everyone to time and also respond to the interest. So I will keep my remarks really brief because I'm conscious that I'm talking to primarily, I assume, a largely programmatic audience. But I do want to, and I'm grateful to David for giving a little bit of time on this webinar to talk a bit about the role and scope of our advocacy work in contributing to our goal of ensuring that children on the front lines of the climate crisis are protected. So the first thing I want to emphasise, and we've heard a lot about the programme offer and the components of the kind of child protection climate change programming. The first thing I want to emphasise is that all of our advocacy thinking, our messages and our recommendations are all completely aligned with the programme offer and build on the kind of the key components of it. So as with all of our work, increasing our programming and in turn our expertise and our evidence gives us a foundation to build on in our advocacy. So the two should be working hand in hand. Conversely, though, our advocacy can also be supportive of our programme goals. So where we're increasing awareness and understanding of the impacts of climate change on children and calling for increased investments or influencing policy frameworks, this provides a conducive context for the work that we want to deliver through our programme. So I'd like us to, as I'm sure we all do, see programming and advocacy as mutually reinforcing and complementary. So I want to draw your attention to the resource that you can see on that slide, which is a set of global advocacy messages and top-line recommendations. And this is really just a sort of an opening offer, really, from the advocacy side. So it's an initial set of messaging, and we'll look to kind of deepen the recommendations and to as we move forward in this area. But at the moment, they provide a basis of language, evidence, and data on the links between climate change and child protection risks, many of which we've heard from very articulately from Bess at the top of the webinar and throughout the other presentations. They also highlight opportunities, our messages highlight opportunities to address the risk to children in and through climate action while promoting children's voice and agency. And as Bess and others have highlighted, children and young people frankly have the most at stake through action or inaction on climate. So a key kind of pillar and part of our approach to advocacy on the climate change, on the climate crisis, is that supports children's own advocacy and campaigning. So in terms of the content of the messages, they cover the intersections between climate shocks and stresses and child protection and other sort of related child rights violations. There is a specific section on gendered risks, and many of those have been outlined today. It's really important, though, to emphasise that particularly when using at the national and local level, the messages should always be contextualised. So we've spoken in quite general terms about the connections between climate, conflict, displacement and protection risks, but it is really important to recognise that those risks, those intersections are context specific, and the interplay will vary depending on other factors and vary depending on other drivers of risk and vulnerability. So evidence should be, and sort of overarching statistics should be used with care. So turning to how we might apply the messages and recommendations, I see that there is sort of broadly, and these are not mutually exclusive, but broadly kind of two domains of advocacy. So firstly, there is about including, our recommendations speak to inclusion of climate considerations in what we might broadly consider to be child protection focused advocacy. So advocacy on child protection systems, on laws, policies, strategies, budgets, etc. So calling for these to take account of climate and integrate specific measures related to climate change. So, for example, strengthening the climate resilience of child protection services would be one sort of area of recommendations. So as an example of that, in the upcoming ministerial conference on ending violence against children, we've included specific recommendations on strengthening the resilience, the climate resilience of child protection systems. And as we've heard earlier, we're also incorporating, there's also the opportunity to incorporate child rights implications, including child protection violations within our CRG work in the context of climate change. The second sort of broad area domain is around including child protection considerations in what we might generally consider to be more kind of climate related advocacy. So that's within in the context of a broader child rights approach. I'm sorry, I've got someone talking in my ear. If you could mute, or if someone could mute them, that would be less distracting. Thank you. So this is the approach taken by climate change advocacy colleagues at the global level, and the impression that I get, although this isn't my area of focus, is that there is opportunity to take that forward at national level. So that's more about advocacy in the climate policy space. So advocacy on policies, plans, investments related to climate adaptation and resilience, including disaster risk reduction, preparedness, response and recovery, but potentially also on climate change mitigation strategies, and advocating for those to be sensitive to, and where relevant, incorporate measures to prevent and respond to protection risks alongside other child rights violations. So as I said, these are obviously not completely discrete and are, they're not complete kind of mutually exclusive areas. And through our advocacy, we should certainly be advocating for these different policy areas to better speak to each other, for child protection actors to sit down with climate policymakers, and for us to play a key role in kind of convening that. And as Laura outlined, there has undoubtedly been progress at the international level. I actually started my career many years ago working in the climate policy space, and I've seen huge leaps forward, both in the kind of UNFCCC process, but also in the child rights space with the General Comment 26 that was mentioned earlier. So those policy areas are coming together, and I think that provides a really strong basis and a set of tools for us to use at the national level. And I'm really excited to see how we can use that to support our advocacy at the national level to strengthen the protection of children. So I will hand back to David. Thank you very much.
Right, brilliant, Alison. Thank you so much. Okay, if you could please try to give us 2 minutes to wrap up. So yeah, I think you have about 4 minutes.
Wow, that is very challenging. That anyhow, it's so good. And then thank you very much for having me here. Then no further ado, I just would like to bringing you now to see like how we put into practice about the climate and protection with the unpacking the GC26, which is in context of Thailand. I hope like this also can inspire you that we can work together, and also you can also provide a recommendation and suggestion for our program and advocacy. So next, please. Actually, child right to healthy environment itself is quite big as the whole of the child rights conventions. But for me right now, I just would like to mention directly and give you an example how we unpacking GC26 here, and then can see like how to be put into the practice into the program and advocacy. For example, if you look into my presentation right now, you can see like I unpacked about the structural violence against children on the paragraph 35 to identify and categorize like environmental degradation along with the harm of impact of the children is a form of structural violence, which is, if you look into your country policy, is very about the child protection, it's very hardly to see the structural violence there. And then also like if you look into the protection of the children right to participation, we are not only see the general comment looking to only the right to participation, but they are intent, in my point of view, they are intent to protections of the children right to participation. You can see from paragraph 4, 26, 29, 30, 66, 70. And then you can see it there that what I mentioned on the screen. And also when we work about the climate justice so much in our Save the Children program, we also can see about this justice for the children on paragraph 11. Now, and also the principle of intergenerational equity. And the last one is a huge one in the child right and business principle, which I found like in paragraph 104 to 115. For this one, it's quite rarely also to find in the CRC declaration that mentioned the accountability for the business principle. And this one also in line in many general comment. For example, general comment 13. And also like if you can see like come up with general comment 27, it will be the next one. It's also mentioned about this one too. And then still link it with the right to development. It have many application that we can use for this one, but this is just how example I unpack this GC26 in the child protection elements. Next, please. Then this is some highlight that I found in the context of Thailand. For example, when we're talking about the sexual violence and also like the right to participation for the people, now it's going to be like involved in any policy that affected to them. We can find since from the Thailand constitutions, we have very challenging to talking about those resources is going to have the community right to manage their own natural resources. And then child right including that? No. And then also the same time, we're looking for like under Thai law and policy, with especially for the business and development projects such as child right to participation and protection. They not even mentioned about the right to access to information and impact assessment, for example, EIA, EHIA, especially indigenous people and also ethnic group. Now, they also have no rights, right to participation in this one, and also the right to development. And this one I also would like to linking with the NDC now of barrier government or plan of action in Thailand a bit. We also found like they have like promotes about the education there, training curriculum promote the right to environmental for the young people, but the protection side not also mentioned in the NDC much. And then looking to the bit in the National of Child Protection Strategy and Policy and Practice, and also in ASEAN and violence against children. Because right now, the ACWC now or ASEAN commissioners on the VAC plan come to consult with us. It's not recognize or integrate the definition of structural violence into, and also like no protection specific on the environmental child human rights defender. And also we look into the for example, the safeguarding policy, and also like the thing that we work within the Save the Children Thailand also that we're gonna review. We found to review it. And then the one highlight is about the challenges in the legal empowerment for children. Children in Thailand have like exclude or limit to access to the justice system, because it's gonna be, it depends on the adults also, and also they have like not have like independent legal standing to claim anything if they get negative affected from the environmental declarations or the climate change. So this is a lot of mentions here, but I can just like bring you to see how put into practice. Next, please. Then from this year, I just would like to see, how we make it into the program and advocacy. And then it's going to be highlight for only this for this one because it's not overwhelm you. And for this one, I developed to make it sure the child protection is there in the programs, policy and practice, and also regionals and nationals advocacy. For example, we put into the child rights situation analysis by unpack GC26 to have the question guideline when we doing the child rights situation analysis for next country strategy paper. Or we will improve child safeguarding policy and protocol with will be include structural violence and how we protecting the human rights defender. And this year we're going to have the environmental child human rights defender toolkit. And then for make it more easier and can integrate immediately on existing project and program we have, I developed the quality benchmark in activity level, which I can show you later. And then in the same time, also this happening after we get informations, this thing is also ongoing now. And then we will make sure the ASEAN EVAC, we call environment against children, mention child protection and also like child right to a healthy environment inside. And then this year, Thailand is going to submit you an alternative report. So we Save the Children lead child inform report, and also parts of the be lead in the CSO report now for our alternative report. And for the next news, Thailand National Child Protection Strategy, we're going to make sure that it's going to be sanctioned inside of that with the voice of the young people influence there that is make sure the children's protection. For example, I give you small info. Right now, the existing Thai child protection policy will mention only child protections in the humanitarian aid assistance. They will get the remedies, they will get the compensations already in that area. But when we're talking about environmental declaration, also low onset climate change impact, they cannot access to that remedy or the protections. And also, like if you're talking about state-led children and also migration, with Thailand has a huge of migration population, especially children, because we are the 4 country borders, right? And then we found that it doesn't have like include them into our strategy, protection strategy, such as it have a lot of problem when COVID now happening in Thailand. Right now it's the same because it still be in the Thailand National Protection Strategy, the plan of action existing one. Then you can see how we do it. And then so we also aim to with the MOU agreement with the at least 4 ministry here in Thailand and the CRC Coalition Thailand, which is Save the Children Thailand. We're leading it on it. It's National Plan of Action on GC26. And then next, please, the last one. If you have any question, okay, I can skip on this. I just would like in the detail. I have a lot of things that's going on.
Yeah, we're all the time. Thank you.
I skip. I'm sorry, everyone, but I can see like right now what I can share is about child rights situation analysis guide, a guideline question I made for the CRSA, quality benchmark on child right and climate justice trainings, QB on STEM and climate training, and also QB on gender and climate training. Because we need to make sure that our partner and also existing program understand this well in the past of the child right to healthy environment and also child protection element that is there. And then you can see like on the pictures is have like advocacy going on and also get a lot of collaboration when talking about GC26 in Thailand. We have agreed, we have talking to the lead ministry in Thailand, and we'll be gear up on that. I hope this gives some like sample from the country level, how we unpack GC26 and make it into program and advocacy. Thank you very much. If you have any question, please feel free to contact me to email and maybe like some question. Thank you very much, David, to support me too.
You're most welcome. And thanks everyone for sticking around for over time.
Would it be possible for me to make a quick intervention, David?
Yeah, you've had your hand up the entire time. I did want to give you an opportunity, please.
Thank you. Yes, so I wanted to also mention that that there are a lot of child's rights violations as well from the transition to clean energy. So children are involved in child labor, from mining for transition minerals to make batteries, such as cobalt and mica, and also environmental pollution from nickel, in Indonesia. So we have this problem in Madagascar and India and Indonesia, also in Latin America, where there is lithium mining. And we actually now have an internal position paper on integrating child's rights into the just transition. And it would be really good if we could also include it in our advocacy on child protection. And I also was going to mention that we also need to strengthen child protection systems to prevent violence and risk to children from climate change. So not only, acting after violence has already occurred to children, but we also need to prevent things from happening so that their rights are not violated. And I'll add the link to the internal position paper and also a report from ILO on child labor and climate change into the chat. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. That's really wonderful. And I mean, I'm really in agreement with you on your last point, with regards to the prevention and mitigation. And I think that's probably the area we've struggled with the most in terms of, what is it that we can do, but it's firmly on the agenda. Yeah. Thanks for the resources. Sounds interesting. Yeah. Thank you. So I don't know how many people are still with us. We still have quite a few. That's really good. I won't keep anyone longer, but we're going to collect all the questions that are in the chat. And I guess the team of us who are presenting, we can try to get to them as a group. And we could sort of put that back into the same chat with this webinar. And I've just put there's the Jamboard link there. I put it in the chat box as well. If you have any thoughts on, I know today was probably overwhelming for a lot of people. There were so many different speakers and so many brilliant people talking about a number of different things. But if you have any thoughts on these two questions about resources or support that you feel like that you might need to do this work, and what are the gaps that you see in particular climate and child protection, although we did have quite a few presentations on child rights as well, and on education and other aspects. But if you have any thoughts on that, what more do you think we should be working on? Laura, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think this was really very rich.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, incredibly rich. Thanks once again to all of our speakers. I'm not sure how many of them are still here, but thanks for hanging with us. And I know how late it is for those of you like me who are in Southeast Asia. It's getting close to bedtime. Thanks again, and we'll try to get back to all the questions as best as possible. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks and bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, great work, team.